What do you think we should do?
I don't know, this is crazy. Crazy.
They said he ruled with fire in his belly and thunder in his voice. A monarch who broke from Rome, sent queens to the scaffold, and tore his country in two for the sake of power, lust, and legacy. But when he died, it wasn't the roar of a lion that echoed through England. It was a quiet collapse, a body bloated by years of sickness, soaked in regret, and too heavy for even the strongest guards to lift without breaking into a sweat. The man who once split the church in half was now too swollen to fit comfortably inside the coffin that had been prepared for him. And yet that was only the beginning of the indignities to come. His name was Henry, eighth of his line, son of a usurper, and father to 3 future sovereigns, and the shadow behind centuries of English history. But for all the fury that filled his reign, for all the blood that stained his hands, his final chapter played out, not in grand halls nor holy cathedrals, but in a small stone vault buried beneath the cold choir of a chapel where most tourists today walk past without a second glance. He had always envisioned something different, something monumental, something worthy of a god among kings. For years he planned it, a mausoleum larger than life. White Italian marble, angels with outstretched wings, a tomb that would rise beside the Abbey of Westminster and whisper to the ages that here lay the man who ruled without apology. Sculptors were hired, plans were drawn, quarrels were had over every inch of ornamentation. But when death finally came for him, in the early months of the year, 1547, none of those dreams had been realized. The tomb was not ready, the crown had moved on, and so they buried him in a temporary vault beside his third wife, Jane Seymour, the only queen who gave him a son, and the only one he claimed to truly love. She had died soon after childbirth, her heart buried alone in the chapel at Hampton Court, her body interred at Windsor beneath the choir stones of St. George's Chapel. It was there, in a dark chamber beneath the floor, that they lowered Henry's coffin, massive, cracked, and already showing signs of decay, and sealed it in beside her, without fanfare, without monument, without even a carved name. But the ground did not keep him. It could not. The funeral procession had been long and dramatic, stretching for miles as horses dragged the hearse through the widened streets, black cloth flapping in the wind, a wax effigy of the king staring blankly from atop the coffin, encrusted in jewels and crowned with a replica of power that no longer belonged to him. Along the way, the body began to rot. It had been days since his death, and the embalming had failed to keep pace with the king's massive frame. When the procession stopped for the night at a former abbey, rumors spread like fire that the coffin leaked, that dogs licked up the dark, putrid fluids that oozed from its joints, that something foul and ancient was trying to escape the wood. Some said it was divine retribution. Others, simply the natural end of a man who had long outlived the limits of his body. But even sealed beneath stone, his story refused to sleep. The tomb would be disturbed again, and again, and again. First, to make room. Then, to bury his enemy, Charles, the first of that name, a king from the House of Stuart, the very bloodline Henry had sworn would never touch the throne of England, was buried beside him after his execution during the English Civil War. The irony was biblical. The vault once reserved for the most fearsome Tudor monarch was now shared with the decapitated body of the man whose rise had once been Henry's nightmare. And to fit Charles in, Henry's coffin had to be moved, shifted roughly, splintering the supports, splitting the wood. No one bothered to repair it. No new coffin was ordered. The bloated corpse of a long-dead king was simply shoved aside and left to rot further in the darkness. Underfoot, more would come. A child of Queen Anne, unbaptized and unnamed, and still later, in the year 1813, when renovations disturbed the chapel once more, the vault was opened by workers and officials alike. The Prince Regent himself, later crowned George IV, stood witness as the remains of Charles were inspected. Henry's coffin, by then, was sagging, broken. The top had reportedly split. There are no official records of what was seen inside. No drawings, no statements, only silence, but silence, when it comes to kings and coffins, is often the loudest truth. Today, if you visit St. George's Chapel, there is no grand tomb for the man who once ruled with unmatched brutality. No golden angels, no inscription carved in Latin marble, just a small stone slab in the floor, one among many, noting that beneath it lie the remains of Queen Jane, King Henry, King Charles, and an infant child. It's easy to walk past, Manido, but below it, entangled in darkness and history, rests the body of a monarch who once demanded the heavens themselves bow to his will, now left to rot beside a woman he loved, a man he hated, and a child who never saw the sky. This is not just the story of a dead king. It's the story of a body that wouldn't stay buried, of a coffin that broke under the weight of ambition, and of a tomb that whispered truths louder than any proclamation ever issued from a throne. In the chapters to come, we'll step closer into the wax face that stared at mourners, into the heart that was buried apart, into the vault that cracked open, and into the final silence of the king who devoured his own legend. But for now, close your eyes. And remember, even kings cannot choose where they truly rest. Before the blood, before the scaffold, before the 6 wives and their shattered fates. There was once a king who danced. He danced with abandon, with youth in his lungs and gold at his heels. A monarch still unbroken by the weight of time or the creeping corrosion of power. In his early reign, Henry moved like a knight from a tale strong-limbed, sharp-minded, and full of pageantry. He used. He hunted. He rode with reckless speed through the forests beyond Greenwich and Hampton Court, his laughter echoing into the trees. He was not yet the beast they would come to fear. He was still, in the beginning, a man beloved by his people and described by foreign dignitaries as the most handsome prince in Christendom. But history has teeth, and in the year 1536, during a tournament that was meant to celebrate strength, something gave way, not in the field, not in the crown, but inside the man himself. The exact moment is lost to the dust of time. But the damage was real. A joust gone wrong. A horse that reared too suddenly. A lance splintering not against shield, but into the force of a fall. Henry was thrown hard. So hard that witnesses feared him dead on impact. For 2 long hours, he lay unconscious, unmoving, while his courtiers held their breath and his physicians stood helpless. Some said he had died. And for a moment, England paused at the edge of panic. But then, he stirred. He opened his eyes. He lived. And yet, something had changed. Something permanent. Something deep. The injury to his leg would never truly heal. It would swell. It would fester. It would cripple him slowly. But the greater wound, the one no salve could touch, was to his mind. From that day on, his temper darkened. His appetites grew monstrous. His paranoia deepened into something feral. He had always been passionate, always capable of cruelty. But now the cruelty had no balance. It was not reasoned, not restrained, not calculated for effect. It became instinctive, impulsive, violent. Friends became threats overnight. Loyal servants found their necks at the mercy of a headsman before sunrise. Queens went to bed in silk and woke up condemned by breakfast. It was as if the blow to his body had cracked something inside his soul, and the pieces no longer fit the way they once did. The leg, the leg would haunt him daily. At first, he covered it in bandages, soldiered through the pain, and forced himself to walk unaided. But by the end of that decade, the wound had become an open sore. Physicians packed it with poultices. The stench of infection followed him from chamber to chamber. His mobility dwindled. His waistline expanded. Food was no longer nourishment. But distraction. Comfort. Escape. And with each new pound, his pride grew sharper not against himself, but against the world that dared to pity him. He ordered mirrors removed. He had staircases restructured. He had servants to lift him from his bed. A mechanical device was built to hoist his massive frame onto horseback. The once princely figure who had dazzled Europe with his grace became a lumbering shadow, swollen with rage, sweating in pain. His leg wrapped in layers of linen that could not stop the rot. And yet, despite this decay, he ruled more fiercely than before. Those who had hoped illness would soften him found instead that it had made him more dangerous. For Henry, once a man of music and sport, had now become a creature of suspicion and silence. He listened less. He commanded more. He questioned loyalty, even in the most faithful. The traitor's block at the Tower saw more action in those later years than in the reign of any monarch before him. He purged not just enemies, but allies, friends, kin. Thomas More, who had once shared jokes and scriptures with the king, now knelt before the blade. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Henry's religious revolution, would find himself arrested without warning, stripped of all title, and executed in a rush. Even wives crowned, adored, and sworn to were not safe. Anne Boleyn laughed in the wrong key and found herself charged with incest. Catherine Howard danced too freely and was branded unfaithful. Heads rolled like fallen fruit. And all the while, the king's leg wept pus and his eyes narrowed with distrust. People whispered that the accident had stolen his soul, that the man who had once been generous and thoughtful, a patron of the arts, a friend to scholars, was now lost beneath the flesh of a creature who no longer knew who he had been. It was not madness in the classical sense. It was not raving or incoherence. It was, instead, a slow distortion. His mind still worked, but it worked in darker channels. He could charm, he could jest, he could even write. His musical compositions and letters from this period show a lingering elegance, but beneath every word was a coiled threat. His court learned to bow deeper, to speak more carefully, to survive by silence. No one told the truth to Henry. Not anymore. Even his children, those heirs he had sacrificed so much to produce, became pawns in the fog of his declining years. Mary, once set aside, was cautiously restored. Elizabeth, born of the woman he executed, walked the palace halls with studied restraint. And Edward, the precious boy, and born of Jane Seymour's deathbed, was shielded from his father's gaze, raised quietly, kept separate, It was as if the entire royal household existed in service to a throne, haunted not by ghosts, but by a living monarch who had become a ghost of himself. There are records. Of course, they survive in parchment and ink. Orders given, edicts signed, wills revised. But those documents do not tell of the long nights when Henry could not sleep, when the pain in his leg brought moans from behind velvet curtains, when servants dabbed sweat from his brow and dared not meet his eye. They do not record the fury when a dish was served too cold, or the terror in a page boy's heart when summoned at dusk. They do not mention the priests who came and went in whispers, nor the endless tinkering with his burial plans. As if the king knew that no tomb would ever quite contain him. By the time the year 1547 crept in, the court knew what the king would not say aloud. The end was near. He had grown quieter, less active, more reflective, or perhaps simply more tired. The body that had once carried him across battlefields and ballrooms could no longer bear his own weight. He no longer rose from bed without assistance. The leg had become a map of agony, the infection deeper than flesh. And still, he ruled. Still, he signed. Still, he held on. But even kings cannot outwait the dark. On a cold January night, surrounded by those who dared not speak too loudly, Henry lay in his chambers at Whitehall Palace and prepared to do the one thing he had never mastered: let go. It is said that Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was summoned, that he held the king's hand, that Henry squeezed once, weakly, just before the breath stopped. No final speech, no grand words, just the end. And when the end came, it was not announced immediately. The court kept the death secret for days, buying time to prepare the transition of power, while the embalmers did what they could, while the tapestries were changed, while plans were whispered in corners. The great king lay still, in silence, his leg, that cursed wound, finally at peace, and the long fall that had begun with a shattered horse ride at last complete. He had stopped being human long before he stopped breathing. The man who once dreamed of golden tombs and marble angels would soon be carried out beneath a crown he no longer wore, through streets widened to fit the weight of his sins. But before that, he simply lay there, alone, broken, heavy with the cost of everything he had done to keep the world bent to his will. And the world, at last, had begun to unbend. They did not lay him in the earth right away. For a king such as Henry, the ceremony demanded time, space, precision, and a degree of grandeur that history insisted must be performed. Even if his body had already begun its quiet unraveling, the air inside Whitehall was thick with rosewater and rot. The windows shuddered against the cold, the floors muffled with tapestries that covered more than stone. They covered silence, secrets, and the slow work of men preparing a corpse too bloated for its box. The embalmers did what they could, but they could not undo the damage of years. The leg that weeping wound had blackened. His belly had grown large, stretched, and unyielding. He no longer looked like the prince once painted in golden frames. And so, they made him again, not of flesh, but of wax. It was not uncommon in those times for monarchs to be represented by wax effigies during funerary rites, especially when decay outran ceremony. But for Henry, the contrast between the wax king and the real one could not have been more stark. The effigy was crafted in haste, but dressed in jewels, robes, and a replica of the Tudor crown. Its face, smoothed and serene, bore no hint of the suffering that had twisted the real king in his final years. No sweat, No bloated cheeks. No ulcerated flesh. Just the mask of majesty. Stiff and shining. Staring ahead with unblinking eyes. This wax king was the one who would be seen by the public. He was the symbol, the illusion, the man who had ruled, frozen in time, before the rot took hold, beneath that polished surface. However, the true Henry lay. His coffin was massive, lined in lead, bound in wood, and required the strength of many men just to shift it an inch. They sealed it, wrapped it, adorned it, and then they set it on a journey, not just across the land, but across the boundaries of myth and mortality. The body was to be taken from Whitehall to Windsor. A procession stretching nearly 4 miles. A crawl through the heart of a kingdom he had ruled with iron will and occasional terror. Roads had to be widened, tree cut down, bridges reinforced. The sheer size of the coffin, and of the man within, demanded it. Horses draped in black cloth pulled the funeral chariot, while trumpets moaned low dirges, and men walked in silence, some bowing, some whispering prayers, some simply watching in awe. Atop the coffin rode the wax king, crowned, bewildered, anointed. For many in the crowd, this was their first and only glimpse of Henry's likeness. They had heard his name, feared his wrath, obeyed his laws, but had never once seen his face. Now, they saw it hovering above the dead weight of the true body, gliding past them like a god on wheels. It was surreal, theatrical, unnerving. Children cried. Old women crossed themselves. The king was dead, but he was also there, watching, unblinking, unmoved. But no one expected what happened when the procession stopped for the night. They reached Sion Abbey, a former religious house, now repurposed after Henry's own brutal dissolution of the monasteries, and it was here, in this ironically desecrated space, that the coffin was laid down to rest until dawn. The wax effigy was removed. Candles were lit. Guards were posted. And somewhere in the hush of the night, something went wrong. Very wrong. The rumors began almost immediately. First, in whispers among the attendants. Then spreading like fog down the procession line. The coffin was leaking. Thick, dark fluid had begun to seep from its base, pooling beneath the boards, staining the floor. The smell was unmistakable, sweet, cloying, and vile, the scent of death not properly bound. The embalming had failed. The body, already swollen and gas-laden, had begun to bloat further. Pressure built. The seals cracked. And now, beneath the effigy's crown, the real king was liquefying. Some said they heard creaking sounds, like something straining within. Others claimed the wood had begun to warp. But the most grotesque tale passed down in hushed voices, half doubtful, but never truly denied, was that dogs entered the abbey that night, drawn by the scent. Strays, perhaps, or hounds, left untethered by careless handlers. They approached the coffin. They sniffed. They licked. And no one dared stop them. It sounds impossible, sacrilegious, too theatrical to be true, and yet it endured. This image of the mighty king's body feeding the low creatures of the earth, whether fact or fiction. The detail was never officially denied. Perhaps no one dared address it. Perhaps it was easier to let the tale fade into shadow. But there was something poetic in the horror. A man who had consumed his nation, consumed his wives, consumed his friends, now being consumed in turn. In the still hours before burial, the next day, They wiped the floor clean. The guards said nothing. The procession resumed. The coffin was resealed as best it could be, and the wax king resumed his place atop the box. The wheels rolled again, and the people watched as if nothing had happened. When they reached Windsor, the real work began. 16 yeomen of the guard were summoned to carry the coffin into St. George's Chapel. Even with that many men, it strained them. The coffin was so heavy, so wide, so unwieldy, that sweat poured from their brows, and the wooden trestle beneath it groaned. The floor had to be reinforced. Nothing about Henry's burial was simple. Nothing was graceful. Every movement reminded them that this was not a man, but a burden. Inside the chapel, the rites were performed with solemn dignity. Priests chanted. Nobles stood in silence. The wax effigy remained on display, glowing in candlelight. As the coffin was finally lowered into the vault beneath the choir, there, already waiting, was Jane Seymour, the queen who died to give him a son. He was placed beside her, the vault sealed, and yet the silence did not last. Centurilateur. When the vault was disturbed once for Charles, once for repairs, and perhaps more often than records admit, they found that the damage had continued. The coffin had split. The wood had collapsed. The trestle had broken under the weight. No one wrote what they saw, but something in their quiet confirmed that the king had not rested well. Today, beneath the stone floor, the remains of Henry still lie, or what's left of them. The wax king is long gone, the crown passed to others, but the real Henry, bloated, broken, and once licked by dogs in the night, remains a ghost in the vault. And above him, people walk. Tourists shuffle across the marble slab. They check their maps. They search for memorials. But unless they know where to look, they pass him by. The most powerful man in England now shares his chamber with a decapitated rival, a grieving queen, and a child without a name. No statue, no shrine, just whispers. And so ends the story of the Wax King, perfect, polished, untouched, and the real king, who leaked into the floorboards, fed the dogs, and never truly left the night behind. Long before he died, long before the wax effigy was lifted onto the black-draped coffin and the dogs came sniffing in the dark, there was a queen who had already been waiting for him in silence beneath the stones of Windsor. Her name was Jane, and she never left the chamber where they placed her. She did not move in death, and she had not moved much in life, not in the way his other wives did. She did not plot, did not dance with ambition, did not speak with sharp tongues or write letters laced in cunning. She was not Anne, nor Catherine, nor any of the women who dazzled courts and died for it. She was quiet, pale, unassuming, but she did the one thing none of them could do. She gave him a son, and that alone made her, in his eyes, a queen worth dying for, and worth being buried beside. Jane Seymour died quickly, and yet not quietly. In the autumn of the year 1537, just days after giving birth to Prince Edward, she collapsed with fever at Hampton Court. The rooms were still full of celebration, the air still heavy with incense and royal hymns. But her skin had turned cold, and her hands would not stop trembling. Infection had crept in through her womb, unseen and unstoppable. She faded slowly, shrinking beneath the sheets as Henry paced in another room, not yet ready to understand that he had won an heir at the price of another wife's life. She did not scream. She did not beg. She simply slipped away, as if retreating from a world that had never truly made space for her voice. She had been queen for barely over a year, When she died, Henry did not marry again for a time. Not immediately, not with the usual hunger. He wore black. He wept. They said, or something near it. He kept her memory close. Not in songs or poems, but in plans. He told his courtiers that she had been his true wife. He ordered that she be buried with honor. And later, when he came to write his will, when death no longer seemed a distant rumor, but a looming fact, he chose only her to lie beside. But even in death, the Queen could not stay whole. Her body was taken to St. George's Chapel at Windsor and buried beneath the floor of the choir, the very place where the voices of the royal singers would rise in every service, every hymn, every holy day. But one part of her did not come. Her heart, the one that failed in the final hours of her life, was removed from her chest and buried separately. In a small chapel within Hampton Court, no grand monument marked it. No carving announced her name, just the echo of her final breath, left behind in the very place where she had labored, bled, and faded. And so, she waited in two places, her body beneath the floor of Windsor, her heart sealed away in Hampton. A queen split in two. Even in death. Years passed. Henry remarried. And remarried again. One wife was discarded within weeks. Another was beheaded. Another survived him. Barely. None of them were invited to the vault. None of them were named in his burial plans. Only Jane. Always Jane. She had been dead for over a decade when he finally joined her. And when his massive coffin was lowered beside hers, when the last rites echoed off the stone walls, it was said that he had come home at last. But home is a fragile word, because while their bones now shared a chamber, she still had no voice to greet him, no breath to release the years, and her heart, the same one that gave him a son and cost her her life, still lay buried far away, in a place no longer visited, no longer lit by prayer. Some say Henry loved her. Others say he simply loved what she gave him. A male heir. Fragile, but legitimate. A legacy secured. A vision completed. But love, in Henry's world, was rarely about the person. It was about the crown, the succession, the continuity of dynasty. Jane, with her soft voice and obedient smile, had never threatened him. She had never questioned him. She had given him the one thing his other wives could not. And in return, he built no statue, carved no poem, offered no eternal words, just a place in his grave. And even that grave would become crowded with ghosts he did not invite. In the years that followed, her tomb like his remained unmarked. No grand effigy. No royal monument. Just a name on a list. Later added by a descendant king who wanted to tidy history, her name sits quietly on the marble slab, alongside her husband, a decapitated Stuart, and an infant whose breath never stirred the world. No one knows what remains of her body. No one knows if her coffin is intact. The vault has been opened, closed, disturbed, resealed over and over again. Some think her bones lie crushed beneath the weight of the king who joined her. Others think her spirit fled the moment her heart was buried elsewhere. But sometimes, late at night, when the chapel is empty and the wind whispers through the arches, you might imagine her voice returning. Not loud, not angry, just present, as if the woman who waited all those years, who gave everything and asked for nothing, might be allowed, for one moment, to be more than a footnote to a monstrous king's reign. And what of the heart? It lies still, in Hampton Court, alone in the chapel. Beneath the carved stone floor, where few stop to look, tourists walk by, snapping photos of gilded ceilings and velvet-lined rooms, unaware that beneath their feet lies the organ that once beat inside a queen. It has no guard, no velvet rope, no inscription that draws the eye. It is forgotten, but it endure. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps, in a life where she was always quiet, always second, always careful, the final act of being buried in two places is a kind of final rebellion, a refusal to be whole, to be claimed, to be confined by a man who took so much from so many. Perhaps Jane, silent Jane, obedient Jane, vanished Jane chose, in death, to divide herself, to keep one piece far from him, a sliver of defiance, hidden beneath the floorboards of a chapel that still echoes with the laughter of visitors who do not know what rests below. Or perhaps it was simply protocol, a surgeon's choice, a physician's practicality, the removal of a heart to slow decay, to ease embalming, a moment of medical routine, now layered with centuries of meaning. We cannot know. All we can do is listen to the silence. And in that silence, one truth remains. She waited for him. Not in life, not in love, not in longing, but in the earth. Beneath stone, beneath hymns, beneath centuries. She waited not because she had to, but because history demanded it, because he chose her. Finally, above all others, because death, in its strange and solemn symmetry, placed them side by side. But if you kneel in that chapel, if you press your hand to the cold marble and listen, you may not hear the voice of a king. You may hear a heart, still beating, still distant, still Herrsch. He was meant to rest beneath angels. That much is certain. In the years when Henry still imagined himself, not just as a king, but as a figure destined to be carved into the face of time itself, he had ordered designs for a tomb, the likes of which England had never seen. It was to be vast larger than his father's Frauner, more ornate than his mother's, and so rich with white marble and gilded metal that it would blind the eye. The tomb would rise inside Westminster Abbey, set beside the tomb of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, but built a quarter larger, standing taller, spreading wider, commanding attention, even in death. He envisioned angels with trumpets, lions of bronze at the base, saints surrounding his image, all under a canopy of marble pillars, draped in golden vines. Italian sculptors were summoned. Commissions were paid. Sketches were debated, and he argued over the details. Because this was no ordinary burial, it was his afterlife, his monument, his proof that even in silence, he would still speak. But the tomb was never built. The plans, once so carefully guarded, faded. The pieces that had been sculpted remained unfinished. The marble, some of it already shaped, waited in vain for the next shipment of stone that never came. The workshops fell silent. The sculptors were dismissed. And when the king finally died, there was no time, no money, no will to resurrect the vision. His children too busy with their own survival, too careful with their funds, too distant from the grandeur he had demanded, quietly set aside the idea. There would be no towering angels, no golden vines, no canopy of saints, just the vault at Windsor, small and dim, waiting beneath the choir stones where his third wife had already been laid to rest. It was never supposed to end that way. But death, even for kings, rarely listens. And so, And they buried him there, not in the royal abbey among the great line of English monarchs, not within a tomb that would echo his legend in marble and light, but in a place that felt temporary, a solution meant only for now, a compromise that history would surely fix later. Except history didn't. Decade by decade, the tomb remained unfinished. And in time, it was forgotten. Windsor swallowed him. They placed him in the vault with Jane Seymour. But they did not carve his name in stone. No effigie. No inscription. Not even a royal crest. For more than 2 centuries, the only markers above the king who had changed the face of a nation were the hymns sung over the choir stalls and the footfalls of those who never knew what lay beneath them. Visitors passed by without pause. The stones were worn smooth by time. But they did not speak his name, and perhaps, in some way, that silence said everything. There are kings who die and are instantly glorified. Statues are raised. Churches ring their names. Historians pen verses of admiration. But Henry, for all his might, for all his fury, for all the thunder of his reign, was buried without the very monument he had once fought so hard to secure. A man who had split the church in 2 was laid to rest with barely a whisper. It is easy to imagine him angry, that great booming voice rising in protest beneath the stone, demanding his angels, his lions, his legacy. But the truth is far quieter, far sadder, because by the time he died, Henry had outlived his illusions. His court was thinner. His power, though still immense, had become weighty, tiring, steeped in pain. His body had betrayed him. His children had become strangers. The past clung to him like chains, and as the last breath left his lips, he likely knew, perhaps even accepted, that the grand tomb would never rise. Instead, he was given a slab. That slab still sits there today, in the choir of St. George's Chapel, among the voices of tourists and the rustle of printed maps. There is a simple piece of black marble. It bears a quiet inscription, not of glory, not of lineage, but of names. It says that beneath it lie Jane Seymour, King Henry VIII, King Charles I, and an unnamed infant child of Queen Anne. 4 people. No explanation. No grandeur. Just the fact of their presence, stacked together in history's quietest room. It does not say what they were to each other. It does not speak of the blood spilled or the promises broken. It does not mention the dogs that licked the king's dripping coffin. It does not recount the vault breaking under the weight of so many bones. It simply lists the dead, not as a legend, but as a ledger. Perhaps that is the truest monument of all, because Henry's life was a theater, a storm of decree and defiance. But his death and his burial became a kind of soft forgetting. The world did not rush to immortalize him. It let him fade. Not in books, not in memory, but in the physical world he had once tried to bend to his will. There was no statue, no bell tolled yearly in his name. No children gathered around his tomb to marvel. He simply vanished beneath the stone, beside the woman he once mourned, and beside the man he once swore would never rule. And in that vanishing, a strange peace settled. Not the peace he planned for, not the peace of golden arches and cherub choirs, but the peace that comes when history grows tired of noise, when the present moves on, when even the loudest kings are finally quiet. There is something haunting in that the man who changed England forever, who broke popes and burned monasteries, who wed and killed and built and destroyed, ended not in marble but in wood, not in glory but in gravity. in a vault too small to contain him, and a coffin too weak to bear his weight. That, perhaps, is the final story of power. It demands everything, but promises nothing. And beneath the slab in Windsor, in the silence that now surrounds his name, that lesson still breathes. It was a quiet day when they opened the vault. No cannon fire, no trumpets, no ceremony. Just the sound of footsteps echoing in stone corridors and the soft clatter of tools against ancient masonry. The year was far removed from Henry's reign, and the chapel that once held the solemn hymns of Tudor mourning had long since settled into its role as a resting place for the forgotten and the remembered alike. But on that particular day, one cold morning in the early years of the 19th century, curiosity, duty, and renovation met beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel. And the grave of a king was disturbed once more. It wasn't the first time. The vault had been opened before, in secret and under cover of necessity. When the body of Charles, the decapitated Stuart monarch, was lowered into a chamber not meant for him. That act, done out of political fear rather than royal respect, had shifted everything. The space had grown too small, and Henry's coffin, already heavy, already strained by time, had to be moved. They say the supports beneath it snapped, that the wood cracked, that the weight of his body alone, swollen in life and worse in death, caused a kind of buckling collapse within the vault. No one repaired it. No one spoke of it beyond whispers. The vault was closed again. But time does not forget such things. Time lets them fester. And so, decades later, the vault was opened again. This time, it was not for burial, but for building. Renovations in the chapel demanded that the workers inspect the lower chambers. Structural integrity, they said, reinforcement. And so men in plain coats and thick boots descended beneath the chapel floor, bringing with them not priests or mourners, but dust, lanterns, and the quiet murmur of practical English engineering. Among them was the Prince Regent, the future George IV, who came not out of obligation, but out of something else. Perhaps fascination, perhaps dread, perhaps that ancient need to look upon death and confirm that it still waits for us all. What they found in the vault was not what they had expected. The air was thick, unmoving. The walls, damp, with centuries of breathless silence. And within that small, stone room lay the remains of at least 4 lives, sealed in wood and lead, slouched awkwardly in the confines of a space never meant to be shared. Henry's coffin was still there, but time had not been kind. It had collapsed further. The trestle meant to hold it aloft had broken entirely, and the immense coffin had fallen to one side. Its top split open from the force of years and weight. No repairs had ever been made. No one had dared to touch it. The King of Kings, once master of church and crown, now lay open to the air, not in triumph, but in surrender. They did not speak much of what they saw. The official records are thin, cautious, respectful in tone, but reluctant in detail. It is said that they opened the coffin of Charles, that they gazed upon the mummified face of the beheaded king, and saw that the features still bore the lines of a man taken too soon. But when it came to Henry, they did not write what they saw. They did not describe the body. They did not mention the smell. They did not record the shape of decay, or the state of his limbs, or whether the jewels he was buried with still clung to the folds of fabric now sunken and gray. They simply noted the condition of the coffin: collapsed, fractured, disturbed. That silence is louder than words. because it means they saw something they could not forget, and yet could not bear to describe. Perhaps the king's face was no longer a face. Perhaps the flesh had melted away to reveal something too raw, too human, too exposed. Perhaps the crown was still there, askew on a skull that once wore it, with such certainty. Or perhaps it was the sheer weight of history in that chamber, the knowledge that this man, this creature of myth and fire and contradiction, was now nothing more than a half-open box, rotting in the earth, that kept them from speaking. The vault was closed again. They did not move him. They did not repair the coffin. They did not replace the broken supports or seal the cracks with new lead. They simply stepped back, one by one, and let the darkness have him once more. Whatever they had seen, whatever truths had risen from that coffin, like a final breath, they left behind with the dust. And that, perhaps, was the most fitting tribute he ever received. Not marble, not stained glass, not a statue with outstretched hands, but silence. A silence that honored not his power, but his ending. A silence that echoed louder than any anthem. Today, few know of that moment. Fewer still remember that the vault has been opened, that the king who once ordered the death of queens and the burning of churches lies in a box that could not hold him. Tourists walk above him, reading plaques that list names but say nothing of coffins or collapse. The stone bears no scars. The chapel's air is clean again. But beneath their feet lies the truth, not of who he was, but of what we all become. Wood splits. Bone shifts. Flesh forgets how to hold form, and kings, no matter how loud, how proud, how monumental in life, fall open like the rest of us. Perhaps they should have built him his tomb. Perhaps he should have had his angels and lions and canopy of gold. But perhaps this is better, because in that vault, there are no lies left, no illusions, no wax statues, only the real thing cracked, broken, unguarded. And in that stillness, he is finally equal to the people he ruled, equal to the wives who wept, equal to the friends he condemned, equal to the enemies he once feared. Just a body, in a box, waiting to be forgotten and remembered again, only when the ground is disturbed, when the wood groans, when the past opens one eye and dares us to look. Stone is meant to last. That is what we tell ourselves, that what we bury beneath it will remain untouched, undisturbed, safe from time and tampering, that no wind can reach through the marble, no hand can lift what has been sealed, that kings, once entombed, will sleep in silence forever. But the truth is that stone forgets too, and tombs, no matter how royal, cannot protect the dead from the living. Henry thought his tomb would rise like a fortress, not just a grave, but a monument, the final act of a reign built on control. He imagined angels and saints towering above his coffin, golden trumpets raised to the heavens, his own likeness carved in white marble, gazing down at generations to come. He wanted people to look up and see not just a king, but a legacy set in stone. He imagined pilgrims walking quietly through Westminster Abbey, lowering their voices in the shadow of his effigy, marveling at the detail in his robes, the solemn curve of his jaw, the weight of his eternal presence. That was the plan. That was the promise he made to himself. But promises made in life mean little in death. The tomb was never built. His children would not pay for it. The sculptors stopped their work. The marble blocks meant for his memorial were left unfinished, eventually lost, or repurposed. And so Henry, the man who had reshaped the church, who had defied the Pope, who had made and unmade queens with a glance, was lowered into a temporary vault in Windsor beside Jane Seymour. And there he remained. No angels, no saints, no roof of gold, just the stone of the chapel above him, and the dead silence of history's forgetfulness. At first, perhaps that vault still offered some dignity. It was sealed. It was clean. It bore no marker. But it was not yet overcrowded. Henry and Jane, lying together, untroubled, the wood of his coffin still strong, the lead lining intact, the legacy above ground still echoing with grandeur. But vaults are not made to be still forever. The ground shifts, walls settle, and history, ever curious, ever careless, begins to knock. The first to enter was Charles King. Ribe, tréteau, martyr. Depending on which century you ask, he had no place to go after his execution. No funeral, no tomb, no home. And so, they slid him quietly into Henry's vault. Careful not to speak of it too loudly. Careful not to stir too many ghosts. But they disturbed something nonetheless. The vault groaned. The space shrank. And Henry's coffin, too large to begin with, had to be moved. The supports beneath him gave way. The wood cracked. The lid split. He was no longer sealed. The tomb had failed. No one repaired it. Then came the child, an unnamed infant of Queen Anne. A whisper of life, never given the chance to cry. They placed that small coffin at the feet of giants, tucked gently into the space where kings had collapsed. There was no space left to make, only space to take. And again, the vault was breached. Again, the promise of silence was broken. And then, as if once were not enough, came the builders. In the early years of the 19th century, as St. George's Chapel was being repaired, the workers came upon the vault again. They had not come to mourn. They had not come to honor. They had come to check the strength of stone, the alignment of arches, the stability of a building that had forgotten its bones. And there, beneath the floor, they opened the tomb not with reverence, but with calculation. The Prince Regent himself stood watch. And what they saw, they did not write in full. The coffin of Henry had collapsed. The wood had warped and broken. The lead had buckled. The massive body inside, already disturbed by the earlier burial of Charles, had pressed outward, its weight too much for the materials meant to contain it. No new coffin was brought. No ceremony was performed. They closed the vault again. They stepped away. They let the air reclaim its silence. But silence does not protect. Time is not gentle. The stone above remains. But what lies below is no longer certain. We do not know what remains of the body. We do not know how much of the coffin has endured. The tomb that was meant to preserve the king has instead betrayed him, not by malice, but by erosion. And the man who once feared no blade, no pope, no parliament, lies fractured beneath a floor, walked daily by those who do not even know he is there. That, perhaps, is the final indignity. Not that he was denied a grand tomb, not that he was buried beside a man he despised, not that his coffin cracked, but that the world moved on without carving his name into the memory of the stones above him. He became, in the end, just another voice lost beneath the choir, his slab indistinguishable from the rest, and his vault too full to honor what he once was. And maybe that's how it should be. Because tombs are illusions. They cannot protect us. Not from decay. Not from exposure. Not from the slow undoing that begins the moment the last shovelful of earth falls into place. They are not fortresses. They are doorways, and sometimes they open both ways. For centuries now, Henry has shared his tomb with those he could not control in life. A queen who died, giving him a son. A Stuart king whose very bloodline he sought to bar from England. A child who never ruled. And perhaps that is the truest monument of all, not one carved by craftsmen, but one shaped by irony. Stone cannot save you from your own story. And that story will be told, whether or not your name is etched above the vault. So when you visit Windsor, and you pass by that quiet slab of black marble, pause. Not for the grandeur, not for the legend, but for the lesson. Even the greatest king of his age was buried in a place that could not hold him. Even the heaviest crown could not shield his body from the crack of time. Even the most ambitious tomb can fail to keep its promise, and even silence, at last, can speak volumes. It should have ended long ago. The story, the throne, the blood, the quarrels of kings and the screams of queens, the swords, the signatures, the sealed fates. It should have ended when the coffin lid closed, when the wax face was removed from the bier, when the chapel doors groaned shut and the hymn faded into stone. But somehow, it didn't. Somehow, Henry, that vast and violent king, refused the stillness death offered him. Somehow, the man who had consumed a kingdom did not go quietly. He was meant to rest. He had made his plans, dictated them with the same hand that signed warrants and erased wives. He had chosen the place, imagined the angels, drawn the tomb in his mind, and then again on paper. Gold leaf pressed between his vision and the sculptor's stone. He had spoken of legacy, of eternity, of being remembered rightly, not for the fear, not for the axe, not for the weight of his cruelty, but for the crown, the church, the boy he left behind. The death, a savior, has no interest in monuments. It waits, and it strips us bare. It levels kings. It forgets what we asked for. And so, Henry was buried, not as he wished, but as history allowed, in a cramped vault beneath a choir floor, his body too heavy for the coffin that held it, his dreams too large for the stone that covered them. They said he was buried with Jane, the only wife he mourned aloud. But the heart she gave him, the heart that stopped after giving birth to his only son, was not there. It had been buried elsewhere, far from him. They said he was buried alone. And then he was not. Charles joined him. A child followed. The tomb cracked. The coffin fell. The king began to disappear. And yet he stayed. Not in body. That part broke down, as all bodies do. The leg that festered, the belly that rotted, the face that melted into cloth and silence. What remains now is not flesh, but echo, not presence, but weight. He lingers in the stone, not because the tomb is royal, but because the story never closed its eyes. There are some names that history cannot put to sleep. Henry is one of them. Perhaps it's because of the wives. The rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. As if 6 women reduced to a jingle could explain the man who broke them. Perhaps it's because of the church, the way he broke from Rome. Not for faith, but for desire, reshaping God around the shape of his longing. Perhaps it's because of the portraits, the bloated eyes, the fur-lined robes, the hand resting heavy on a dagger, on a scepter, on the shoulder of a queen he would later destroy. But perhaps it's something simpler. Perhaps it's because Henry in life, and now in death, reminds us of the cost of power. He won everything. He had everything. And still, it wasn't enough. Six mariages. 3 children. 1 son who died young. 2 daughters who ruled alone. He silenced parliament. Hegutted monasteries. He ruled through fear. And when fear turned on him, he ruled with isolation. And in the end, he died, not loved, not hated, but avoided, not mourned in the streets, but watched from windows, not remembered with songs, but with rumors, the dogs, the dripping coffin, the wax face, the stone slab, the vault too crowded for a king who once demanded the world make room for him. You can stand above that grave today. You can place your hand on the marble. You can whisper his name. Though you don't have to. He already knows you're there. That's the strange thing about Henry. He stays. Not in the way a ghost rattles chains or slams doors. Not in flickering candlelight or the creak of ancient wood. But in the quiet weight of unfinished legacy. In the space between footsteps in the chapel. In the silence after a guide moves on to the next tomb. And doesn't mention his name. He stays in the questions. Was it love? Or only want? Did he mourn? Or merely miss control? Did he ever look at his hands and see blood? Did he ever hear? In the hours before sleep, the voices of the women he sent away, the men he betrayed, the friends who bowed before the blade. We don't know. And perhaps it's better that way. Because the Henry who stays isn't the one who ruled. It isn't the Henry who hunted in the forest, or jousted in tournaments, or danced with Catherine of Aragon beneath the torches of Greenwich. It isn't the Henry who kissed Anne's neck before he signed her death. It isn't the Henry who stood silently outside Jane's door while she bled out his future. It isn't even the Henry who groaned in pain while his leg festered, while his body gave up its shape. No. The Henry who stays is the one who remains in that vault lid cracked, tomb disturbed, forgotten by the marble that never came. He stays because something in him refuses to lie still. And perhaps, so do we. Perhaps we revisit his name, not because we admire him, but because we see in his fall something unspoken about ourselves, the hunger for legacy, the fear of irrelevance, the desperate desire to be remembered for more than our worst days. And perhaps we keep opening his story because it was never truly closed, because history forgot to give him peace, because stone failed to seal him in, because the tomb couldn't hold the weight of what he was or what he tried to be. And so, we end not with a throne, but with a slab, not with a crown, but with a vault that still shifts in the dark, not with triumph, but with something quieter, sadder, truer. The king is gone, but he isn't resting. And perhaps, neither are we. Good night, Your Majesty. We see you still.
This cannot be my final resting place. place. This cannot be my final resting place.